Hello, friends, and welcome into another weekly update on behalf of our team here at North Carolina Family for this week ending on August the 1st. Gentlemen, it's hard to believe it's already August. It has been an historic week down at the General Assembly, the legislative building, and there is so much that we need to cover, so we're going to jump right into it on veto overrides. You've heard a lot about those veto overrides from a lot of different people, whether it was the legislature, whether it was the press,
the governor, maybe?
The governor, maybe, and some of the press releases that he has put out. Gentlemen, an historic day this past Tuesday when how many vetoes by the governor were overridden by the General Assembly?
Well, the governor, has vetoed 14 bills so far. On Tuesday, the state Senate overrode 12 of the governor's vetoes, and the House overrode 8, which is, I think, the most veto overrides that we've seen in a given day in North Carolina history. So a pretty phenomenal day, a lot of activity, and a lot of veto overrides.
Yeah,
not a lot of close votes.
Yes, sir.
Maybe we'll get to that. Yeah.
Not all of the vetoed bills by the governor were vetoed, overridden by both chambers, and so there's still a little bit of work to do. Yeah. We'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. Let's jump right into the main one that we have covered extensively, and that is HB 805, a multifaceted pro-family bill. We call it that because it started as one thing, and then it became this, I don't want to call it monster because that sounds negative.
Omnibus.
It became an omnibus of all things amazing for families. Gentlemen, let's talk a little bit about exactly what this bill did and then the path as it made it to the governor's desk, off the governor's desk, and now it is now the law of North Carolina. What did this bill cover, John?
Well, Mitch, when the bill was introduced in the House, it was designed to prevent the unlawful publishing of pornographic content on the internet, to protect women and children in particular from being exposed and having their images published on pornographic websites. When this bill went to the Senate added a bunch of provisions in it that would define male and female based on biological sex in state statute, administrative rules, and state regulations. It would prohibit the use of state taxpayer dollars to pay for puberty-blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, and gender transition surgeries for prisoners in the state's prison system. It would extend the statute of limitations to 10 years for malpractice actions arising out of an injury associated with a gender transition procedure, as we've seen with some individuals, detransitioners, who are trying to, as best they can, reverse the effects of the gender transitions that they may have gone through and may have been coerced into by the physicians, counselors, and others. The bill would also direct local boards of education to adopt policies to allow students or students' parents to opt them out of instruction if it would infringe upon their religious liberties. It would also direct local boards of education to adopt policies to provide online access to parents to a catalog of all library materials so that parents can understand what's in the school libraries and also opt their children out. And in addition, it would direct schools to adopt policies prohibiting the schools from forcing students who are of the opposite sex to room together on overnight trips. So again, an omnibus bill that's chock full of a lot of important measures, including what it started out with or started out as to prevent the unlawful publishing of pornographic content on the internet.
So human dignity, parental rights, education, my goodness, chock full of a lot of stuff. Right. Jerry, at the beginning you mentioned razor thin votes. Right. This one was one of those. And what do you want us to know? What do the listeners need to know about this vote and how it transpired?
Yeah. Well, with the veto, we've told you before, there has to be 60% of the members present and voting. So they had to assume everybody was going to be there. Not everybody was there in both chambers. I think they were one short or so in each one. But literally every vote, that always counts, but in this case,
yes, absolutely.
They did, as we've said before, in the Senate, the Republicans have a supermajority.
Just barely.
Their exact number, 30, and that's where I believe almost all the votes were right at 30 on these veto overrides in the Senate. On the House, there were some bills where the original vote on the bill, there were more than one Democrat or one Democrat, and those were the ones that were pretty much brought up. This particular bill, it was exactly at the 72 number that was needed. The original, and we don't need to get into the names, but this is what's important about how you all are involved in encouraging people who represent you. We don't know all the dynamics that cause people. One of the original votes on this bill, that member went with the governor's veto. A different member who did not vote for this bill when it originally came through voted to override the veto. Again, it was just one of the things that we all kind of wonder, well, what is it that caused this to happen? When sometimes you don't ever know, but you have to believe that a lot of it is when people like yourselves, as well as us and others, are encouraging members in their votes.
Yes.
Sometimes sometimes you hear the saying, it's the last voice that people hear sometimes. When they're reminded, wait a minute, they're right. This is what I need to do.
Well, we heard from multiple people, and we believe that this past Tuesday was a historic day for multiple things, and some of those people that voted the way that they did. And math is important. We watched one instance, John, and I won't go into all the specifics of this. We've talked about math on this show multiple times in the recent past, where the members present and 3/5 and it had to be drawn to the attention of the presiding officer that the number that voted was the exact math to do that. It's just fascinating how it all works, and probably for nerds like me, it's way too interesting. Another one that we really haven't talked a lot about on our show, on this update video, is S416, which is a donor privacy law. John, what's so significant about that, and why do we need to know more about that?
Well, this bill would basically prohibit the state government from forcing nonprofit organizations like the Family Policy Council,
Yes.
like the ACLU, other nonprofit organizations on the left and the right, in the middle, whatever, from turning over their donor list. And we have seen instances in states across the nation, in particular in New York State, where our colleague, Jason McGuire, who runs the New York Family Policy Council, has been the subject of a 3-year witch hunt by the Attorney General, Letitia James, in New York State to try to force him to turn over his donor list, which he refused to do. And with good reason, because that information ought to remain private, that we need to protect the identity of donors to nonprofit and charitable causes. But she was attempting to get his list so that she could, we assume, as she has attacked him, to go after some of his donors as well. And it's just, that's unfair. This bill is intended to help provide protections and a buffer so that kind of thing cannot take place.
So that bill made its way through the process. It went to conference committee. It was vetoed by the governor, and yet again on this past Tuesday, that bill was the governor's veto was overridden by both chambers. And not to speculate too harshly here, but I think churches may at some point even be drawn into the crosshairs of such attempts to elicit donor records and things like that. And so this would protect all those nonprofits here in the state of North Carolina from that potential action. That's very encouraging.
It is. I don't know why. I mean, just as a note of reaffirming the point that's being made here, I guess in today's news, I saw yet one more time an elected official voted a certain way. Demonstrators came to their home. Yeah. And we've heard it happening with judges. And this would sadly mean that for donors, that people could all of a sudden start appearing at their home if they didn't like what organization a donor was supporting. So this was an important piece of legislation.
And it's important, again, and I would state, for organizations on all ends of the political spectrum, all points on the political spectrum, and advocates. There were lots of advocates from all points on the political spectrum in support of this bill, because this information, it's important to maintain protection and privacy for donors to charitable and meaningful causes.
So there were 14 bills, 12 were overridden by the Senate, 8 by the House. the numbers don't quite add up to get to 14 there. One of the things that we noticed is that the House and the Senate took up bills they believed they were confident they had the votes to muster an override of the governor's veto. One of those bills that we've talked about that was not heard or was not seen by the House, it was overridden by the Senate but not the House, was S227, which is a bill that would eliminate DEI, divisive concepts and practices in public education. That bill was not heard by the House. One could draw the inference that they may not be confident right now that they have the numbers, the amount of votes necessary to override the governor's veto.
Yeah, and there were two other DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion bills similar to the one that dealt with K through 12 education, one for higher education and one in state government, that would prohibit, as you say, these divisive concepts and discriminatory practices in those levels of government. So those were three of the bills that had been ratified by the General Assembly, sent to the governor, vetoed by the governor, and that came back to the legislature. The Senate overrode the governor's veto on all three of those bills. The House did not take those up, presumably because they weren't certain that they had the votes to do so. And so those are still pending, but are important measures, and we're hopeful that the House will be able to muster the votes in the coming weeks or months to ultimately override the veto on those bills.
And if I'm not mistaken, on all those bills, like you say, the three in the Senate and the one that originated in the House, the DEI bill, there were no Democrats in the House who voted for the original bill. And so that's where, unless a day comes where certain members are absent or some Democrats say, oh, I'm going to change, I am going to support this legislation, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll keep you up to date on S227 and its way through the process and whether or not they ever vote to override the governor's veto on that. One of the things that was done on Wednesday of this week, and Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, was HB 87, which was originally meant to be a bill, or was originally a bill that limited mobile device usage in public schools. One of the things that came out of the big, beautiful bill was the ECCA, or the Education Choice for Children's Act. And on Wednesday of this past week, the House and the Senate both, or on Tuesday and Wednesday, the House and the Senate both got together and they voted to implement the structure of this here in the state of North Carolina. John, what do we need to know about this particular bill?
Yeah, and this bill basically would opt the state of North Carolina into this provision of the big, beautiful bill. And it basically creates a federal tax credit for individuals and entities who make qualified contributions to a scholarship granting organization. So that tax credit, the federal tax credit, would be $1,700 that they would contribute into a fund that would then provide scholarship funding to individuals, to students within North Carolina. And so I think North Carolina, if we are not the first state, we are certainly one of the first states to pass legislation, at least by the General Assembly. Now the bill is on its way to the governor, and we'll see what the governor does with that. But yeah, we're one of the first states to take action on this, and we're excited to see that move forward.
Yes, sir. So we'll let you know about that as it moves forward. Another thing, in the General Assembly this week, we've been a lot of talk about the budget, what that's going to look like moving forward. Would we have a budget? Would we not have a budget? Well, the answer is in part yes, but not all the way. As Jerry likes to point out, we now have a mini budget. Now the question was, would there be,
as opposed to the one big beautiful
budget
bill? Yeah, we've got a little mini budget
surrounding this mini budget. Was it the first of many mini budgets, or was this the only mini budget? Time will tell. What do we need to know about this mini budget that was passed this past week?
Well, the explanation yesterday was they realized something needs to be done with certain provisions. And unfortunately, we shared with you, the House and the Senate have some very different ideas. I think they originally agreed on around $32 billion. Yeah. But how they each wanted to arrive at that number, as far as appropriations, where money would come from, there was not, and there is not, agreement. They have continued to meet, even though the legislature hasn't been in town. the budget leaders made it clear they're continuing to meet to try to work out these differences. What they agreed on yesterday, if I heard the numbers right, out of that 32 billion, this was about 1 billion. It is a step in the right direction. They indicated they will hopefully be back to agree to more provisions that we can enact into our state law as far as our budget's concerned. And I know we've mentioned before, North Carolina has a different situation from the federal government. We don't shut down when there's not an agreement on the budget. They continue with the previous budget. But obviously there are new needs, there are adjustments, a lot of things that need to happen.
Absolutely.
Continued discussions about funding for Western North Carolina for the continued repair, renovations, restructuring, and all of that. So those conversations will continue. I guess there was a hearing yesterday to talk about the furtherance of that, and so we're going to continue to see that, as it is a significant and necessary priority for the state. But all of that is tied into these budget discussions that will be ongoing.
Yeah, and they mentioned, I don't know if we were talking about getting into it, what they do at the end of a session is they have a resolution that kind of tells you what they're projecting for the next number of months.
An adjournment resolution.
Yeah. And
Sort
so-
of adjournment.
And the sort of adjournment means, in this case, every month from now until April of next year, they're scheduled to come to Raleigh, or if they need to, if they have something like a budget agreement or something else that requires or needs attention, they can come back on those dates. The speaker did indicate yesterday at this point, they don't know when that might be, but they have set these dates. And then after the one at the beginning of next April, at the end of next April, they will start the short session. And that's what they kind of laid out at the very end of their work this week.
John, it's good to be back in town. Over the last 2 weeks, you were at 3 different conferences. I was at 2 different over 1 week, 2 in the same town. But John, what did you take away from the ADF conference, FPC conference, and the Social Conservative Conference? SoConCon.
Yeah. Well, the ADF conference, which was 2 weeks ago, Alliance Defending Freedom Annual Summit. This took place in Orlando, and it's a bringing together of, hundreds of allied attorneys that work with ADF, policy leaders, pastors, school leaders, just a whole host of policy and influential people from around the country coming together to share ideas, to brainstorm, to network, and it was a really, really great conference, very, very encouraging. And then the next week was our annual Family Policy Council conference that was pulled together by our national counterpart organization, Family Policy Alliance, which we're very grateful for. It's always great to see our colleagues from around the country. There are 40 states that have family policy councils.
Kind of like a family reunion.
It very much is.
Yeah.
It really is. And getting together with everybody just to encourage, to share, to talk about best practices, to talk about policy challenges, and just the great things that are happening. A very encouraging time. And then the SoConCon, or Social Conservative Conference, which is a broader bringing together of a lot of folks who work in the conservative policy space, both on the state level and the national level. Just a really, really encouraging time. And it's just so great to hear from leaders, from folks who are, on the front lines in states across the nation and also in our nation's capital, talking about and sharing very helpful information about what's going on. One of the things I would say that was most encouraging to me was hearing at both of these conferences from the chairman of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, Andrew Ferguson. And he shared, and actually the week before the ADF conference, the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, held a full-day workshop in Washington, D.C. on the dangers of gender-affirming care on young people. We talk about puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, gender transition surgeries on youth, and they're looking specifically at this issue from the standpoint of whether or not it is an unfair and deceptive trade practice, which I think is fascinating, and really give kudos to Chairman Ferguson for using his role and his position and his leadership to explore this issue. They're also looking at the harm that social media companies are doing, enticing our youth into just being on their phones all the time. And we've talked about that the legislature here in North Carolina is pursuing measures to prohibit youth under the age of 14 from even having social media accounts. So there's a lot going on, both on the state level and on the national level, through the leadership of folks like Chairman Ferguson and others who are really doing some incredible work. And I just find it to be really encouraging and affirming the work that we're doing here. And you were at the
Yeah.
FPC SoConCon. What do you think, Mitch?
A lot of positive policy initiatives, whether it was marriage or assisted suicide. I know it's a really fun thing to talk about, but stopping the proliferation of that harmful activity, things like that. I joked and said my favorite was the fourth session and all those breakouts. There's usually 3 of them. In some of those, the hallway session with all the people and having, this, I kind of like to talk
That's
to people.
like saying lunch or PE is your favorite subject in school.
You could never tell that. Just getting to talk with people and hear
Yes.
what's going on in their state, and as you talked about some of those best practices and things that we can learn from their mistakes, or they can learn from our mistakes or their successes. It's just a really encouraging time to get together with those people. Speaking of those people, and you mentioned one of those at the very beginning, or at least in regard to one of the bills that we covered, Jason McGuire and his story. John, tell us what we need to know about his story.
Yeah, well, Jason is a wonderful brother in Christ. He runs the New York Family Policy Council. He has been, as I said earlier, the subject of a 3-year witch hunt by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, on all sorts of fronts. He has handed over, from what I understand, over 7,000 pages of documentation. He would not hand over his donor list as they demanded, because that's just not right, but he handed over 7,000 pages of documentation.
Millions of dollars.
And it's just amazing that out of that, the Attorney General's office identified 3 very small irregularities that existed. Jason admitted to those minor infractions, but was ultimately sentenced to 8 weekends in jail. So he is spending he spent last weekend and the next 7 weekends in jail in New York to pay the penalty for these minor infractions. Other elected officials and other people have reported much more egregious infractions and violations of the law and have been sentenced to nothing. But Jason is just an incredibly gracious and winsome individual, and has just submitted to the authority of the state to spend this time in prison, to do that time that he's been subject to, and then we'll see where things go from there. But I would just ask you all, please pray for Jason McGuire and his time, and just the impact that this is on him personally and his family, just for protection, for wisdom. I know that he's also already shared that he's ministering to some people in jail. So just that the Lord would use this time to bring glory and honor to himself, and to affirm Jason and his family, his wife, in the work that they've been doing for years.
So if you're watching this, and this email is coming out on a Friday morning, if you're watching this on Friday afternoon, Jason's family is going to drive him to the local jail, and he is going to walk into jail once again. So pray for him as he goes in to a 9x9 cell and ministers to people in jail this weekend. Jerry?
I was just going to mention, I didn't know if you were going to go there, John, because you had shared some of what God is doing in the midst.
Yeah.
And that's where, I don't know, you can think of a lot of verses, maybe not, rejoice in the Lord always. He is letting God work through him in a situation where he could be bitter, angry, and just saying, I can't believe I'm having to do this, that he's saying, God, please minister through me. And he, first weekend, apparently immediately starts ministering through him there.
And our sermon in church last Sunday was about Paul and Silas in prison, and the Lord bringing an earthquake, opening the doors and opening the shackles, but they stayed because they wanted to honor the Lord. And it's just in the midst of these really challenging, unfortunate circumstances, men, leaders like Jason are allowing the Lord to use that time to be a witness and to minister to others. So not only are we praying for Jason, but we're praying for his fellow prisoners, those who are imprisoning him, the guards and others who come in contact with him. And we're also praying for New York Attorney General Letitia James.
That's right.
That somehow God in his grand providence would use this circumstance, if he so desires, to bring her to a personal faith in Jesus Christ, if she doesn't have that already. So we want this, and I know that Jason wants this to be just used for the benefit of the Lord, and that he is a willing, sacrificial believer and brother in Christ to do this, and we're grateful for him.
Well, an historic week here in the state of North Carolina. A lot going on. We'll keep you up to date on all the things you need to know about from right here on the NC Family Weekly Update. On behalf of our entire team, Jerry, John, I'm Mitch, and thank you again for watching this week's Weekly Update video.
God bless you.